Well, hello. My name is Susan Elliott, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. I'd like to welcome all of our participants today to our program, The New Normal, Evolving Alliances in the Middle East. And we are very happy to have two distinguished experts to speak to us today, Hussein Ibish and Aaron David Miller. Before we get started with the program, I think many people probably now are familiar with how to use Zoom, but we will have a discussion among the three of us to start out with, and then we really encourage our participants to ask questions. And if you could, you can go to the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and type in your questions. And the NCAFP staff and myself will monitor that and then ask the questions to the appropriate panelist. So with that, I'd like to get started and welcome everyone to our program, The New Normal, Evolving Alliances in the Middle East. And I'd like to introduce our two panelists. We have Hussein Ibish, who is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, but he's also a weekly columnist for Bloomberg and The National, and he's a regular contributor to many other US and Middle Eastern publications. So I'm sure that many of you have read what he's written or have heard him on the television or radio. We also have Aaron David Miller, who again is an expert on the region, and he's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator in Republican and Democratic administrations. And he also is a CNN Global Affairs analyst and has recently written a book, The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want to Have Another Great President. I think that the title of your book, Aaron, sounds like a topic for another conversation or program that we would have. But I'd like to start out with, and today, you know, we want to talk about evolving alliances in the Middle East. And I think the recent establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and other countries of the Middle East, Bahrain and the UAE, has made us start to wonder, well, what's happening in the Middle East and what does that mean for not only now, but the future? And I'd be interested in hearing, you know, your thoughts, given that you've worked so long, not only on the Middle East, but also especially on the, you know, what I call the Middle East peace process, but the Israel-Palestinian issue. So Aaron, welcome.
Thanks, Susan. It's an honor and privilege to be here with you and also, of course, with Hussein, for whom I have the highest regard. He's far more a regional specialist and analyst of these matters than I. I'll offer a few big picture observations and then turn it over to Hussein. First of all, I would say as a philosophical matter, I do not believe in transformations. I mean, they occur, but usually they take time to play themselves out. I guess I am a follower of the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who argued that the best you can probably do is proximate solutions to insoluble problems. And I'm reminded in the early days of the Arab Spring how I was hammered for even suggesting that what was in train would not fundamentally alter the region for the better. And I fell back on a quote by Tacitus, the first century Roman historian, who basically said that the best day after the death of a bad emperor is always the first day. So I think we need to be extremely careful and cautious. And number two, I think what's happened, certainly with respect to the Emiratis and the Israelis, is more of a transactional arrangement. Mm-hmm. It could lead to a transformation if others follow, if there is some effort to redress the Palestinian issue. But I think it was a narrow coincidence and alignment of three sets of interests on the part of the Israelis, the Americans, and the Emiratis. I think it was driven, and Hussein has made this point repeatedly, by a region in flux, which is changing, a set of Arab priorities, which have fundamentally been altered by several things. A rising Iran, dangers posed by transnational jihadi groups, a Gulf Arab alignment, particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis, and there may be differences in how they perceive this issue, but very worried about the American approach toward Iran. And by both's desire, and I do not believe we can rule this out as a primary cause, in order to secure what I describe as off-the-table benefits from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Off-the-table benefits in a quote-unquote peace negotiation usually means a lot of sophisticated weapons.
Yeah.
In the case of the Saudis, it's a little more complicated since there are other problems with the U.S.-Saudi relationship and other desires that the current Saudi regime, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, may want to address with the Americans. But again, whether or not this leads to whether the transaction becomes a transformation, and I think it has the potential to do that, is, in my judgment, very much an open question. As far as how it's going to impact on regional alliances, I'm not entirely sure that's the right word to use. Alliance, I would use the word alignment. And I think it certainly could have an impact. But I see a region that actually is going to demonstrate more continuity in terms of the way things are currently structured than profound change. It is fascinating to me that the three Arab states that competed for influence and power for the last 7 decades, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, all in their own way are, quote unquote, my words here, offline.
Yeah.
None of them are able to project the sort of power and influence that they have. This, of course, has opened up an opportunity for a number of states, primarily in the Gulf, that were least affected by the Arab Spring and have managed to carve out, some recklessly, see Saudi Arabia, parens, close parens, others in a much smarter fashion, see the Emirates, a bigger role for themselves. Now, these are still, even in the case of Saudi Arabia, tiny countries. How much regional heft and reach they will have is unclear to me. And we can talk about the Palestinian issue in a bit. I want to turn things over to Hussein. I would only conclude by saying the following. If I had to watch 3 states in the region, they would not be states in the Arab world.
Right.
They would be the 3 non-Arabs.
Yeah.
Israel, Turkey, and Iran. All are stable domestically, all have tremendous economic potential, all have the capacity demonstrated, I might add, both for good or ill, to project their power beyond their borders. One is a member of NATO, the other is America's closest ally in the region. A third is, well, I'm not sure how I would describe Iran, but it's clearly in conflict with varying degrees of conflict with both of the others and, of course, with the United States. But the non-Arabs are functional.
Yeah.
They're real states. They're keepers. And I suspect that over time, it's important for all of us to keep our eyes on them. Hussein, over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. I'd like to say thanks to Ambassador Elliott for inviting me and Aaron. And Aaron, it's always a real honor to be with you because you're not only incredibly brilliant, you're also one of those rare people who was a great practitioner as well as a great analyst. That's unusual. Usually people are good at one and not good at the other, but you are actually really good at both. So it's an honor. I'll give you my view on all of this. I think in the big picture, the context in which this new set of alliances, and there will be more Arab outreach to Israel normalization processes. This is not the end of it, in my view, unless the whole thing goes haywire, which I don't think it will, because Israel and the United States have every incentive to make it work for the UAE and Bahrain so that others, will not hesitate to go forward, is strategic diversification. This is a world that is transitioning from relative monopolarity to relative multipolarity. It's a world in which the United States' relative competitive advantage has been in continuous decline since the heady period in the immediate end of the Cold War. and other powers are continuing to rise, most notably China, but also Russia and the BRICS and whatnot. And the American will in the Middle East has undergone, I mean, the American will to exercise power in the Middle East has been damaged by the Iraq fiasco and to some extent the Afghanistan adventure, which couldn't have been more wrong-headed in the way they were done. In addition to which, I think there's a general rise in kind of neo-isolationist sentiment on the left and the right. So you've got an American withdrawal from the world generally, or a reduction in American power in the world generally, and a sense in the Middle East that the United States is less willing, less able, and less ready to be the guarantor of a regional order and whatnot. So countries are looking to diversify strategically. Even a country like Kuwait, whose foreign policy used to boil down to we're close to the Americans, is strategically diversifying. So you look at it's no accident that the first countries to bridge this Gulf-Israel divide, Israel and the UAE, are also the two Middle East countries that are furthest along in cultivating Russia as a strategic partner. Israel got the start on that a long time ago. The first Arab country that was a close US ally to reach out to Moscow was the UAE, and the UAE is now consolidating a partnership with Russia, not starting one like Saudi Arabia is, or some of the others are. So this is very significant. Strategic diversification is what's going on here. Now, I just want to distinguish for a second the interests between the UAE and Bahrain in going ahead, because they don't have exactly the same priorities, and it's important to recognize what they are. All right, Bahrain is the Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog, and the UAE is Isaiah Berlin's fox, right? So the hedgehog knows only one thing, but it knows it really well. And Bahrain's one thing is Iran. Iran, both under the Shah and the Islamic Republic, has had a 100% claim, territorial claim on Bahrain. That's unique. And the Shah tried to seize Bahrain when it was becoming independent from Britain and was beaten off by the US and Britain. The Islamic Republic has at times reiterated that claim. The Shah renounced it in 1970, but basically Bahrain is under a kind of, how should we put it, suspended death sentence as an independent state from Iran. There's also this large Shiite majority, and it's the one Gulf Arab country where Iran's subversive wings, the IRGC and others, have been able to make headway with the opposition, right, and provide them arms and create real unrest. So Bahrain is obviously very interested in reaching out to Iran's major military enemy in the region, the country Israel, which is doing the heavy lifting against pro-Iranian militia groups in Syria, increasingly in Iraq, etc. So it's kind of a no-brainer for Bahrain. For the UAE is the fox. It has many ideas. So it's interested in Iran, but it also sees Turkey as a rising hegemon in the region. And there is a subset of Middle Eastern countries, this does not include Saudi Arabia yet, and may never, but there is this little alliance of countries. It's the UAE most of all, but also Egypt, Sudan, and Israel, which view Turkey as a new rising Sunni Islamist version of Iran, and the Muslim Brotherhood parties as the functional Sunni Islamist equivalents, not of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but of Hezbollah, the PMF, pro-Iranian PMF groups in Iraq, the Houthis, the GNA in Libya, etc. Now, those Islamist groups, sub-state or quasi-state actors that are directed not only by a transnational revolutionary agenda, but by the foreign policy of a state. That this alliance of Sunni Islamists that was kind of inchoate and existed 10 years ago has become consolidated as a creature of Turkish foreign policy in a new way. And so this alliance brings together Israel and the UAE. UAE is also very interested, as you I'm sure know, in US weapons systems, the F-35 system, the Growler electronic warfare aircraft. Electronic warfare is extremely important to the UAE. They have a very small population, good special forces, good air force, but they must have electronic warfare. This is absolutely crucial to them. And the Predator drones, which again is something they want to do. The US has proven its efficacy time and again in the hit on Al-Muhandis and Qasem Soleimani at the Baghdad airport. That was a Predator drone with precision guidance. The UAE wants that, to pursue the same counterterrorism agenda as the US and Israel. I think the UAE also, by the way, is thinking in terms of Iron Dome as a missile defense system. Israel is thinking about introducing military people to man and arm the Iron Dome, and therefore get a foothold on Iran's doorstep in the Gulf. So this is a kind of big, and then also the UAE was very interested in outreach to Washington, in not only consolidating with the Trump administration, but outreach to Democrats, mainstream Democrats in Congress, and distinguishing between themselves and Saudi Arabia, and saying to Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, all the mainstream Democrats, look, stop saying Saudi UAE. We're different, we're better, we're not like them. Here's our big justice. And it worked beautifully. I mean, they were getting their calls returned the next day, from people like Speaker Pelosi, who was not really returning their calls. And I mean, I'm not making this up. This is actually true. So, obviously it worked very well in that regard. There are other things. There's one other thing worth mentioning. UAE sees itself as a tech hub, and it wants to go far in technical R&D. It's got a moon mission that is preparing. It's got a Mars mission, Mars probe right now. It looks around the region at what other small country on cutting edge stuff has gone further or can deal in the same way. It's Israel. And they're especially interested in electronic warfare and surveillance and cyber and all that strategic, security stuff, but also in making money. It's also worth saying that there is a well-known short list of countries that could follow. But the short list is also the long list, right? This is sort of the crucial thing to understand about the Arab world right now. I think there's no doubt that Sudan, Morocco, and Oman are waiting for the opportunity to do this. And I think if Qatar could figure out a way of doing it without annoying Turkey and Iran too much, they would too. So there are 4 countries just waiting in the wings to do it. The only question about whether they're on the short list or the long list, which is not going to do it, is Saudi Arabia. And you can see the Saudis really preparing the groundwork in their media and in the way they've received this normalization process and the way they approved the Bahraini one. Bahrain would not have gone forward without Saudi approval. UAE would, but Bahrain is a dependency of Saudi Arabia. It's a protectorate of Saudi Arabia. And so they needed permission. Obviously, they got it. So that means Saudi Arabia is open to the possibility and is laying the groundwork for such a step in the future if they decide to do it. It's just that the Saudis have this very long list of concerns that their smaller neighbors don't have. They have regional Arab leadership that they don't want, but has been thrust upon them for the reasons Aaron cited about the, this offline character of the traditional Arab centers of power. They have Islamic global leadership that they do want, but they're pushing off Iran and Turkey and a Turkish, Pakistani, Malaysian troika, which is challenging them very strongly at things like the OIC. They are a little beleaguered on that front, and they would be very careful about what they did to damage that. And they have much more complicated domestic politics. Aaron called them a small country. Well, maybe they are in global terms, but it's actually geographically not that small. It's over 30 million people, and they have complex politics in Saudi Arabia, regional, ideological, sectarian. They have to be very careful domestically. So when they make this decision, it will be a complicated one in a way that it won't be for Oman and even, I would say, Qatar and Sudan and Morocco. It's going to be more straightforward for them. The final thing I'll say, and I know I've been long, but I'll just wrap up, is this all leaves the Palestinians in a heck of a bind, because their strategy until now has been the Arab Peace Initiative, which was basically a consensus of Arab countries that they wouldn't go forward with diplomatic relations with Israel, except in the context of arranging to end the occupation and a two-state solution. And now clearly the UAE and Bahrain have broken that consensus, and at a very minimum, they have flipped the trajectory here, the hierarchy of chronological accomplishment, where it's no longer peace first and then normalization. It's now normalization first, and maybe we'll see about the occupation or not, depending. And so the Palestinian leadership's bluff is called. They put all their chips into a basket that was controlled and defined by somebody else. And for the past 10 years, if you had asked Palestinian leaders, what's your strategy towards Israel, they either would have cited the Arab Peace Initiative or they described the Arab Peace Initiative without using those words. And now they've got nothing. And it's been taken away from them. There's not a thing they can do about it because they were relying on others who had different interests. That was a crazy thing to do. So it's a terrible blow to the Palestinians, but it's going to, I think, force them to come up with their own strategy, which is something they always should have had and something they definitely need. And we can talk more about that if you like.
Well, why don't we move then? I was going to say maybe this till later, but we have some questions in the Q&A box about where does this leave the Palestinians. So since Hussein has told us his thoughts, what are your thoughts on that, and how does that affect, you know, the process that we've been working on for years and trying to find a peaceful solution between Israel and Palestine?
Right. Well, let me just begin with I left government 17 years ago, and my conviction, this is the 20th anniversary of the Camp David Summit, July of 2000, which by my judgment was the last best chance. Although the more I have thought about it, the more I begin to understand that it was ill-advised, ill-conceived, and ill-timed.
Yes.
That the Palestinian problem, or a conflict-ending solution between Israelis and Palestinians. And I've been arguing this for 17 years. It's annoying to people. I understand that. Nobody wants to accept it because it really does, I think, force the conversation back to some first principles. You need three things. You need two leaders who are masters of their political constituencies, not prisoners of their ideologies, number one. Number two, you need a sense of ownership. There's this very famous piece of philosophical advice that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. And the reason people don't wash rental cars is because they don't own them. So you need a sense of ownership. And every breakthrough in this region, Israel-Egypt, Israel-Jordan, Israel-Palestinians occurred, and let me be very dogmatic about this, without the foreknowledge of the United States. That should tell you something. And finally, you need an external mediator, whether it's the United States or somebody else, that essentially knows what it's doing. And we haven't had one of those since the last most consequential Secretary of State that I had the honor to work for, Jim Baker, and his friend and ally in the White House, George H.W. Bush. So I think you need at least one of the first two. And number three, in order to create a negotiation that even will allow the parties to get close. We don't have any of them. None of them. So we will be operating for the foreseeable future, in my judgment, in the space between a two-state solution that is still too important to abandon on one hand, but too difficult to implement on the other. That's the space that everyone will be operating in. And frankly, I find it very difficult, given the changing priorities, to see how that is somehow, that space is consequentially broadened to allow a serious negotiations. There's not a single country in the world, I put the United States at the top of the list, that is prepared to make the Palestinian issue the centerpiece of its Middle Eastern policy. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post a month or so ago in which I admitted we got a lot of this wrong. We didn't believe that normalization was possible before some major initiative on the Palestinian issue. The peace camps, wherever they are, believe that Israel would somehow become a pariah nation, an isolated, hammered, battered nation if it didn't settle up with the Palestinians. Well, guess what? The state of Israel has more representation now than at any time since its independence. And the great betrayal, which Hussein has brilliantly laid out, is the regional betrayal. These states will continue to mouth their support for the Arab Peace Initiative, even while they cut their own separate transactional deals. So I think Hussein is 100% right. I do not see what strategy, unlike many, I do not think that given the views of the current Israeli government and the current administration in Washington, that the Palestinians putting out a strategy or a new set of proposal, unless they're prepared to capitulate,
well, no,
is going to be possible, frankly, or productive. So I have no answers on what the Palestinians are going to do. Final point, I've just never seen them more demoralized, more dysfunctional, and more divided.
Right. So that's the problem, in my view, if I could just add something very
go ahead.
Palestinians don't have a national leadership, right? They don't, not only they don't have a national strategy, that's a function of a deeper malaise. They don't have a national leadership. It's not just that they're divided. It's that the two sides in the division, the Fatah leadership and the Hamas leadership, are not national leaderships. They don't aspire to be national leaders. They don't think like national leaders. Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority and the chairman of the PLO, does not have, and he's shown this time and again, does not have the mentality, the aspiration, the ambition of a national leader. He acts and thinks like machine politics mayor of Ramallah and some adjacent areas. That's exactly how his priorities seem to function, practically speaking. Hamas is engaged in ruling and consolidating this little weird emirate in Gaza, but it's more connected to regional powers than to other Palestinians, to parts of it, the military part of it. The Qassam brigades is more connected to Iran. The political part is more connected to Turkey. A lot of it is very embedded in the Muslim Brotherhood network. And again, they don't think or function like national leaders. They're either subnational or transnational in their attitudes, depending on whether they are more inward looking or outward looking. But I mean, I tend to agree with Aaron. There's not much a Palestinian strategy can do to undo the occupation in the short run. One thing they could do is strengthen their society, care for their people, prepare for the future, make themselves a stronger group. That they could do. The last person who tried that was Salam Fayyad, and he was brought down by the United States and Israel, and revenge for the UN. They gave by taking away his budget, gave his rivals in Fatah the ability to throw him out. My sense is that what we're entering into is a period where this problem is not only not international, it's not regional, it's between Israel and the Palestinians, period, right? And that means that probably there's not much that can be done politically until the roof falls in. And it will fall in, because this is not a reasonable or sustainable situation. I think, historically, these things tend to go along just fine until all of a sudden one day it becomes absolutely untenable. And this can happen over a while, and it's up to the Palestinians to figure out a way of making it happen, or it can just suddenly happen. But this business of a country in which way more than 1/3 of the people are not citizens and are totally disenfranchised and live under martial law and have basically no rights is not a tenable situation. It doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And that's the situation that the de facto state of Israel has and has had since the 60s. So you cannot anymore talk about it as a temporary occupation. I used to be very afraid of the word apartheid when it came to Israel, because it's a conversation stopper, and it gets people arguing about apartheid, and it gets people arguing about history and terminology. There's now, in my view, no rational basis for shying away from that word. This is what we have. We have a long-term, open-ended apartheid state in the Middle East. Fine. But I don't think that's a tenable long-term arrangement.
Let me just add a couple points to what Hussein said. Number one,
my job very easy. I don't have to moderate.
He's 100% correct in noting that the Palestinian issue has gone from an international issue to a regional issue to a local.
Can I say domestic? Yeah, local.
Meron Benvenisti, who passed away recently, in the 80s, was describing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a shepherd's war. Mm-hmm. And with the exception of Jordan, that has tremendous equity here, I don't see how the issue returns to center stage without some, as Hussein put it, dramatic manifestation of either pain on a level that goes qualitatively and quantitatively above anything we've seen. And believe me,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an American here. I'm not going to appropriate Israeli and Palestinian pain here, but you've seen a lot of pain there without much change in the status quo.
Yeah.
Pain is one way to change the status quo. The other, of course, is prospects of gain.
Right.
But without sufficient pain or gain, and I would argue to you that perversely and paradoxically, the Israelis and Palestinians are virtual masters at maintaining a status quo, which all of them deem to be less risky than the costs to each of them for changing that status quo. I mean, I'll remind all of you that Sadat and Rabin paid an ultimate price for their peace initiatives. Watching Arafat and Barak at Camp David in July 20 years ago, I heard Arafat say at least 3 times, "You will not get an opportunity to walk behind my coffin." I often thought what Barak thought about Rabin, given the fact that Sadat and Begin were the only other 2 Israeli and Arab leaders to be present at Camp David. So it would take, and Hussein is right, the conflict is impervious to anything that the United States would be willing or able to do. I said be willing or able to do. Nor do I think any other third party or collection of third parties, the vaunted international community has demonstrated, particularly in the age of the COVID, an unwillingness to assert itself in the face of a international threat to climate or to public health, let alone to situations like Syria, which are far more bloody and costly than the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So again, I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence by suggesting that I'm clueless, frankly, with respect to what specifically could be done under these circumstances to break out. Hussein mentioned apartheid. Well, nobody believed, I didn't, that apartheid would end in anything other than a major bloodbath. It ended because you had 2 leaders, Mandela and de Klerk, who owned this and were able to manage a transition into another reality.
Right.
Just, I can't.
But there was an obvious win-win in South Africa, you
Yes.
know, which was you stop discriminating against us absolutely and relinquish political power, and we will not take any of your stuff away from you, including your civil service jobs or anything. Right. Like we stop here, going forward, no more discrimination, but no backward unpacking of it, except truth and reconciliation, which is symbolic. I don't see that, you know, happening in this case, especially given what Palestinians owned in 1948 and now belongs to Israelis or to Israel. And it's just very hard to imagine what that would look like. However, I do think Aaron is pointing at something important, which is these things can change very quickly, and they probably will. I'm thinking, you know, we're gonna think of this as absolutely intractable for a while, and then things are gonna change overnight, and we're going to ask ourselves, why the hell didn't we understand it this way? And I think that's where this is headed. And I just say that because historically there is no precedent for such an arrangement being viable, and I don't see why it should be here.
Well, you know, and it's interesting in hearing both of you talk about who could be the Palestinian leader and where would the win-win be? Because I think at least at this point in time, especially since the perceived supporters of Palestine, at least in my opinion, you know, the other Arab states now are starting to align with Israel. And I think as Hussein, you pointed out, it's more for other than ideologic reasons, business reasons, security reasons that they've done this and kind of left the Palestinians by the wayside. So I think if I were Palestinian at this point in time, they're definitely, they've always been maybe at a disadvantage, but, Israel has taken what I'll call steps to take away some of what their at least perceived support was. But, I want to, I know we didn't mean to only talk about the Israel-Palestinian situation, but clearly you can't talk about the Middle East without that. But one of the things, because we've got quite a few questions, but one of the things, and I think this has been on my mind as well, you both talked about, and Hussein, you wrote an article about who are the winners, who are the losers. But I think one of the issues, I think that, and maybe this is part of the US reason for trying to do this, is Iran. And I wondered, and this can be for both of you, but one of our participants has asked, what happens, we kind of know what will happen if President Trump gets reelected. But what happens if Vice President Biden gets elected and he decides that we want to get back into the JICPOA, get back into the Iranian nuclear deal? And, how would this be stabilizing, unstabilizing? And how would this affect, what we're seeing happen now? So either one of you can.
I would just offer a comment about the Biden administration. President Biden, assuming he becomes President Biden, and you get through the period of contestation, which is going to happen in some form or another in the days following November 3rd, assuming this is not a landslide, both in the Electoral College or in the popular vote. This man is going to be shackled with the greatest challenge of national recovery. Since the 1940s, since Franklin Roosevelt, without, I might add, a world war that strengthened America at home and abroad. We are weaker at home, and we are not bereft, but we are without the influence we need abroad. I could identify 5 crises that reinforce one another, from the greatest threat to public health since the great influenza of 1918. And by the way, it's not recovery. Biden is going to inherit the COVID.
An ongoing pandemic. That's right.
You've got an economic recession now after 2 quarters with structural changes that not even the most brilliant economists can anticipate in terms of what's happened in this country.
It's unprecedented.
Polarization along racial, class, and political lines unseen, perhaps in the 60s. You've got a crisis in crisis of confidence in American institutions, from the census to the post office to the very nature of our electoral system. So I think the bandwidth for heroic diplomacy on the part of the Biden administration is going to be very narrow. It will be low-hanging fruit, rejoining Paris climate, phone calls to the allies, a global summit of democracies, maybe quiet contacts. I mean, you're going to end up with a Biden administration that is going to be probably peopled with individuals who were responsible for crafting and negotiating the early stages of the JCPOA and then some. So maybe you will get a dialogue, but you've got Iranian elections coming up in 2021, and you've got this preoccupation. If the Democrats take the Senate, it might be easier. If they don't, the Republicans will be looking for every reason. Mr. Trump from outside the system, and the Republicans from inside. So I'm not persuaded that you're going to see giant leaps in foreign policy, Middle East foreign policy, by Mr. Biden, at least for the first year.
All right, I have a couple of things. I mean, Aaron's absolutely right, but I do think, look, the first thing is I do think either second Trump term, but especially a Biden administration, no matter how small the bandwidth is going to be looking to restart a dialogue with Iran, because maximum pressure, unless you entertain fantasies about regime change, which has never been imposed from the outside by economic sanctions, and is not going to be in this case. I mean, You know, unless you're thinking about regime change, what maximum pressure has done is to produce, yeah, a political blowback against the United States and Iran, and maybe some isolation of the US internationally, but it has created leverage with the Iranians. This is a fact. I mean, Iran is damaged, badly damaged, rocked internally, regionally on its heels in Syria, on its heels to some extent in Iraq. Even though it has accumulated so much regional power, it's not growing, it's receding a little bit. And its economy is in really bad shape, and domestically, it's not as stable as it should be by any means. So there is this leverage to be used, right? And it should certainly not be squandered by anybody. Now, the good news is that if you keep your ear very close to the ground, you can tell that the Iranian position, which is they need to return to the JCPOA, they need compensation. They need to get, you know, money for all the ills they've suffered from the sanctions, is bluster. They will, I am convinced, they will accept compliance for compliance. In other words, they would go back into the JCPOA if the United States would go back into the JCPOA and lift the sanctions. You can make compliance for compliance contingent on other things, especially a commitment to discuss these other issues, and contingent and you know, really sort of put it in a context of a broader understanding about what Iran faces if it doesn't come to terms on these other issues, and start looking for a way to have a dialogue with them. Because, I mean, either they continue like this or they make some kind of a deal. They have a real incentive to try to make an agreement. I think they would be interested. The only thing is you need more buy-in. The problem with the JCPOA, among other things, is it lacked not only domestic buy-in, which is, you know, partisan problem, but it lacked regional buy-in. You've got to, I think, do more to reassure the Israelis and the Gulf Arabs, et cetera, that this is not dangerous to them. There is another advantage now that was not there in 2014 and 2015, which is that not only is Iran suffering in a surprising way, maybe not more than they were economically, but to a surprising degree, the US ability to impose painful unilateral sanctions has been really effective, more than I thought it would have been, certainly more than the Iranians anticipated, right? So they're scared. And they're even scared about the sanctions, you know, post the arms embargo. Is really, you know, everyone's being asked, who do you prefer to trade with? Washington, do you want to really pick a fight with the US Treasury? Or, you know, do you want to forego that stupid little contract in Iran? And people are not, they're risk averse. Business people are risk averse. They're not taking this risk of tangling with Treasury. The other thing is the rise of Turkey complicates the sense of Iran as a unique existential threat to the Gulf. One of the reasons that you have this Gulf rapprochement with Israel is that Iran is seen as an existential threat throughout the Gulf in a way that Israel never was. Israel doesn't have any territorial designs in the Gulf. It's never had a bullet fired with any of the Gulf countries. So Iran is a real threat, and Israel is, you know, a kind of moral issue. But I think for some of the Gulf countries, Turkey is also, especially for the UAE, arising as a problem. And you've seen real outreach from the UAE to Iran, right? I mean, a foreign minister to foreign minister level, which is pretty extraordinary, as well as lesser from Saudi Arabia. So on the one hand, they got a taste of what conflict feels like, you know, during this maximum resistance campaign of the last year and a half, including, and above all, the Iranian attacks on Abqaiq and Khurais, the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia. This is a very painful reminder that they're very vulnerable, and the UAE in particular, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, very vulnerable to Iranian strikes. But also the UAE is very keenly aware that Turkey is another threat. So Iran is not the only threat as it used to be perceived, or the unique sole threat. So there's a lot more. I think it's a lot more complicated picture on all sides. And I think there is room for a discussion, and I think there's a basis for discussion. I'm not nearly as pessimistic as I was a year ago.
Well, we've had several questions, and I'll try to incorporate them and, you know, maybe merge them together. But, you know, I think it was you, Hussein, who mentioned at the beginning sort of the role of Russia and China. And we've mentioned a little bit about Russia And we've also talked about Turkey. But, what about China? We have a lot of our members are interested in China's influence around the world. And, one of the questions focuses on the IRI's relationship with China, which is kind of an economic relationship rather than other. But, what do you think about what will happen with China? And one of the things that is a question here is, are there areas where we could maybe capitalize on, rather than seeing this as a zero-sum game where, all of these countries are kind of vying for influence, but are there ways, because of disruptions in the supply chain, because of the kinds of things that, Aaron mentioned about how, COVID has affected the whole world economically, that we could look to try to find something positive about, not only the influence of China, but, how maybe we could turn, a situation that sounds pretty bad into at least one or two things that could be positive. So that's sort of my glass half full rather than half empty. But, what do you see about China and, what China's doing in the region?
Aaron, go right ahead.
I mean, you're looking, it's another outside-in approach in a way.
It is.
And I just wonder, given the absence of a broader understanding, both with Moscow and Beijing by this administration, and the challenges that are going to face the Biden administration, assuming Biden becomes president, whether or not you could work that outside-in relationship. I mean, if you want to resolve some of the region's knottiest problems, Syria, for example, you'd need a measure of cooperation, not just with Iran, but with the Russians. And it's hard for me to see, John Kerry went through this painfully during the Obama administration. It's hard for me to see a regional cooperative framework without addressing a broader strategic sort of, rapprochement is the wrong word, between a US administration and Moscow and Beijing. And it's hard for me to see that right now. The Chinese will continue to exploit their advantage, although their public image has taken a hit as a consequence of COVID and the extractive sort of dependency that they want to create through their economic outreach into the region. They're also clearly recognizing opportunities on the nuclear side with the Saudis and others. So that's going to be a problem. I just don't see, I guess the bottom line is the region is ungovernable. There's not a single regional power that has the capacity to fundamentally alter its trajectory, nor an external power that can somehow dominate it. Hussein's right, it's strategic diversification and multipolarity, and that usually leads to
chaos.
Conflict and confusion.
Yeah, the chaos is the watchword. Yeah, so then the question then becomes, is it in the interests of these rising powers to have a chaotic Gulf region? Is it, or Middle East region? Is that useful to them? The answer might be yes, but it might well be no. And I think it's worth exploring. Russia has maneuvered itself largely because of the lack of direction, consensus, and will in the United States into a position analogous to the one the United States found itself in after the 1973 war. That is to say, everybody's go-to interlocutor. It's a completely exaggerated, ridiculously sort of, there's no objective correlative for that role in terms of its military and economic power, but that they're willing to do it and we're not. So there you go. As long as that's the case, I think Russia is important. I think the Syria example is a good one. Is there a win-win, barely acceptable, or at least mutually tolerable endgame in Syria post-war? And I think we're starting to get the sense that for most actors, the answer is yes. And it's very distasteful because it involves the survival of the Assad regime, which is very distasteful to me too. But, that's the reality. No one's willing to go to war and invade Syria and get rid of that guy. His supporters in Iran, Hezbollah and Russia, intervened and saved him when he was about to go down in the summer of 2015. And you know, Turkey has replicated that model in Libya with the GNA by swooping in and doing the same thing for the Tripoli government there. And so basically we're in a situation in the Middle East where outside powers are able, with the application of a limited degree of force, to save their pet clients from going down in limited areas, not even in the whole country, but in the areas of greatest concern. We've seen that time and again. In the region, there is, in the long run, the potential for you know, a kind of a framework that recognizes spheres of influence between Arab states, Turkey, and Iran. But it's going to take a lot of work. In the end, it needs outside guarantors if it's going to function. And there, I think you could see the United States, Russia, China, and maybe even India and others acting as, you know, global guarantors, because everyone has an interest in a certain degree of stability and maritime security and energy resources and all that. This is a Pollyanna view. It's a very optimistic view, but it's not impossible. It's not even implausible. It's just difficult to get there. So that ought to be, I think, the goal that we would work on. The US role, I think, ought to be transitioning not out, but into a balancing one. I think we should seek to play a balancing role. That doesn't mean accepting everybody's policies, you know, sort of uncritically. I think balancing in a region cannot mean accepting a foreign policy based on cultivating sub-state actors that usurp state functions. The whole Iranian approach to projecting power is fundamentally antithetical to a concert of regional states or anything like that. It's got to go. But at the same time, Iran has legitimate interests, a legitimate sphere that it needs to operate in, and so does everybody else. And this has to be thrashed out. And I think outside powers, all of them, have to play a constructive role if they're interested. If they prefer chaos, there's nothing stopping that. That's easy. That's very easy to arrange.
Right. It's worth pointing out, too, that this is not your grandfather's or your grandmother's Middle East.
No.
Where somehow the U.S. is expected to emerge as the pivotal power, what one of my former bosses, Madeleine Albright, called the indispensable power. I mean, I think we also have to face up again to the reality that foreign policy strength and resilience begins at home.
Right.
And there are several reasons why the Middle East is increasingly less important to the United States than ever before. Failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, these trillion-dollar social science experiments, which have never paid out not only what we have put into them, but the misery and the death and destruction that our own operations have wrought. Our own freedom from dependence on Arab hydrocarbons, I think, has created a measure of political space that we didn't enjoy up until now. A rising China, which will in fact become the main foreign policy preoccupation of the United States, and other issues, pandemic, climate. We're going to have a whole new definition here.
Yes.
What homeland security really means. We spent billions in the wake of 9/11 against the threat of jihadi terror against the continental United States. And yet when the threat came, when the major threat to American peace, security, stability, the entire economic system came, it came in the presence of a virus.
Right. And
I think that has reframed the whole concept. And my own final comment is we need to decide what about this region is vital to American national interests and what is discretionary, because we do not have the bandwidth any longer to get bogged down in adventures, military operations, nation building exercises, or Hussein, to get dragged in to the bitter politics of the Saudi Iranian.
No, I agree with all of that. I agree with that. But I would point people, just to do a quick caveat on all of that. I mean, I think a lot of what you're saying is right. But I agree with Steve Cook. Steve Cook has, I'm not going to, I'll just draw your guys, all the audience attention to a piece in Foreign Affairs that Steve Cook has written about the enduring importance of the Middle East to the United States. There's a reason why successive presidents, beginning with second term W, wanted to pivot away from the Middle East, and everyone who tries it can't. It's because every time you try to do it, you confront the reality of the consequences of doing that, so this region has this tenacious hold. Cook's article comes out of some conversations I had with him and Katulis and other people, and he's, you know, I subscribe fully to his analysis. I think it's a very spot on analysis. The other thing is, Aaron's right about the craziness of our approaches of swinging wildly from wanting to reshape the region from afar, rule Afghanistan from 3,000 miles away, crazy stuff, create a democracy in Iraq, ridiculous ideas, to thinking that everything is doomed in the Middle East, and Obama saying Russia would bleed to death in Syria, etc. What we've forgotten, what happens when you identify a narrow goal and expend just enough resources to achieve that very narrow goal, and if it doesn't work, you walk away. Putin has shown the way. Now, I don't think you have to be a ruthless mass murderer to achieve your goals, frankly, and I don't think you have to ape Putin's role in Syria, but I think he's demonstrated that you can achieve a lot in the Middle East for a little if you're willing to use your leverage in a clever, very, very limited manner, right? And I think we should do well to remember that we've done it in the past. And it's not true that every intervention has to be the size and scope of these crazy, or even the size and scope of 1991. Even that's probably way too big. The point is, if we were to craft reasonable goals and expend a limited amount of energy and money and lives, you can achieve a great deal. It's when you swing between hubris and fecklessness that you get into this incredible trouble. And then you start to think nothing can be accomplished, and that's not true either.
Well, you know, we've reached the end of our time, and I want to thank you. This hour has flown by, so it means we need to have another one. And I would just say, I'd like to pick up on what you've just said, Hussein, about looking for ways that we can find some small, reasonable goals that perhaps not only would satisfy U.S. foreign policy objectives, but help us rather than be at odds with other countries like China and Russia, but to work together in the region. So that's a huge, huge recipe, but I hope that we can have a discussion in the future on that, depending maybe after the presidential election, when we know who's our next president and how we can see, you know, what are our next steps in the Middle East. So I want to thank both of you for a very, very stimulating and interesting discussion, and I look forward to more. So thanks so much.